Good news, kids! There's a Star Trek cartoon show! And the TV guide says this week's episode is about Spock going back in time to meet himself as a child on Vulcan. Doesn't that sound like fun? 30 minutes later, why are you crying? This is a review of my favorite episode of Star Trek the Animated Series, Yesteryear. If you have not seen this episode and you don't want to know what happens in it, be warned, spoilers beyond this point. Yesteryear is not only my favorite episode of Star Trek the Animated Series, it seems to be just about everybody's. I don't care about what is and isn't considered canon, personally, but I do think it's telling that back when the canonicity of the animated series was in question, one of the only episodes that the producers of subsequent Star Trek shows definitely considered canon was this one, Yesteryear. It established a bunch of stuff about Vulcan and about Spock's backstory that stuck around and became permanent parts of the fiction. The desert known as the Forge, Spock's pet Sailot, which is first mentioned in the original series, but not actually seen on screen until Yesteryear. And when a Sailot is seen in an episode of Enterprise decades later, it looks more or less the same as the one we see in Yesteryear. The scene of Spock being bullied by other kids for his human heritage. That scene is adapted with only a few changes for the 2009 Star Trek film. And the question that we, as thoughtful and critical fans of Star Trek, should ask is, why? Why has Yesteryear become the one episode of the animated series to be universally accepted as canon even when the rest of it wasn't? There's a practical answer. This episode tells us things about Vulcan and about Spock's character history, so when the creators of later shows in the franchise had a need to refer to those things, they pulled from the animated series, because why not? But I think it goes beyond that. Because, as I'm always saying, Star Trek is made up. It's not a documentary, which means writers of stories that came after Yesteryear didn't have to treat it as though it actually happened. They could have just made up their own stuff about Vulcan or Spock's childhood or whatever. I think the reason why Yesteryear was treated as canon by other Star Trek writers, even when the rest of the animated series wasn't, is that it's just an excellent episode. What jumped out at me as I watched it this time is how much of that excellence is carried by the script. There are multiple barriers that could potentially keep an audience, especially an adult audience, from engaging with this story. These barriers are a result of the nature of the series. By today's standards, the animation is low budget and relatively simplistic. The voice acting is stilted at best and at worst, as in the case of the child actor providing the voice of young Spock, pretty awful. But somehow, by the end, none of that matters, because the script is so good that it's able to smash through those barriers. The story is simple. Kirk and Spock return to the present after a research trip into the past through the Guardian of Forever and find that no one other than Kirk recognizes Spock. The Enterprise's first officer is now an Andorian named Thalen. They do some checking in the records and discover that the timeline has been changed, that Spock died as a child, and that his parents separated following his death, and his mother was ultimately killed in a shuttle accident. Spock remembers a time when he was 7 years old, and his cousin Selleck saved his life in the desert. After talking it over with Kirk, Spock realizes that his cousin Selleck, who he never saw again after that, was actually himself as an adult, meaning that he was destined to travel back in time to meet himself as a child. The timeline was changed when some historians used the Guardian to observe Vulcan history while Spock was in the past with Kirk. Since adult Spock was unable to be there to save himself, he died at age 7. So Spock uses the Guardian of Forever to go back in time, meets his father Sarek, passes himself off as cousin Selleck, and follows his younger self out onto the Forge when 7-year-old Spock runs away determined to prove himself. Young Spock's pet Sailot, Ichaya, comes along. Adult Spock is able to intervene and rescue his younger self when a Vulcan cougar that looks like Battle Cat and sounds like Godzilla attacks, but unfortunately, Ichaya is injured by the creature's poisonous claws. Young Spock races back across the desert to the city to bring a healer, but by the time the healer arrives, it's too late. Ichaya cannot be saved. The healer gives young Spock a choice: allow his pet to live on in pain, or give him a peaceful death now. Young Spock chooses to euthanize Ichaya, wanting his beloved pet to die with dignity. They return home. Sarek is impressed with how young Spock handled himself in the desert. Sarek bids farewell to who he thinks is Cousin Selleck, and adult Spock says, "Do me a favor. Try to understand your son. And when he's 8 years old, if he happens to set fire to the living room rug, go easy on him." Adult Spock returns to the present. Everything is back the way it was before. Kirk says, "How'd it go?" Spock says, "Fine, except my pet died." Kirk says, "A pet? Well, that wouldn't mean much in the course of time." And Spock is like, "It might to some." "You monster, I thought you were my friend!" And that's pretty much it. This episode makes an excellent case for the half-hour format being well-suited to Star Trek. A lot happens in Yesteryear. It never feels rushed thanks to the skillful pacing, and thanks to the half-hour running time, it never drags. And in between hitting its major plot beats, the story still finds time for meaningful moments with these characters. There's a show of respect between Spock and his temporary replacement Thalen, where Thalen realizes that if Spock succeeds in his mission to the past, Thalen's time as the first officer of the Enterprise will be erased from history. Thalen's not mad, though. He gets it. Spock is trying to save his own life and the life of his mother. Thalen wishes him luck. There's a scene between Sarek and young Spock where we see the pressure that Sarek is putting on his son and how much young Spock feels he has to live up to. And there's a similar scene between adult Spock and young Spock when they're out in the desert, where adult Spock assures his younger self that his human heritage is nothing to be ashamed of or worried about, and that the Vulcan way of living through logic and emotional control is a path to serenity that few humans will ever experience. And then, of course, there's the scene where young Spock is confronted with the death of Ichaya and forced to choose. Does he make the selfish choice to keep his pet around a little longer even though Ichaya will be in pain? Or does he make the selfless choice and release his pet from suffering? The euthanasia of Ichaya is the focal point of a lot of discussion about this episode because it's unusual for a kids' show, especially a kids' show in the 1970s, to deal with such a heavy topic. And I agree, the episode does deserve to be complimented for that and for how well it handles that subject matter. But what I really appreciate about it from a storytelling point of view is how it manages to both fulfill and subvert our expectations. Young Spock is nervous about a coming-of-age ritual he'll have to undergo soon, so he runs away to the desert to prove that he's tough enough to meet this challenge, just like the full-blooded Vulcan kids who are always picking on him. We expect young Spock will have to prove himself by surviving the elements or through an act of courage or something like that. The episode sets us up for a test of young Spock's physical endurance and maturity. But instead, we get the death of Ichaya, and the crucial test becomes not a physical one, but an emotional one. It's a bit of a slide. It's very well done, and it pays off. The young Spock must prove himself set up perfectly and in a way we don't necessarily expect. This episode is written by D.C. Fontana, arguably the most important writer who worked on Star Trek: The Original Series. Though she served as story editor for the entire series, Yesteryear is the only episode of the animated series she actually wrote herself. And it shows. I have a soft spot for the animated series. I enjoy it a lot. Yesteryear is certainly not the only good episode, but it's a cut above the rest, and that's because of the script. Fontana understands these characters, understands this world, and tells a story that is meaningful, has real emotional weight, and is able to transcend the technical and aesthetic limitations of the show, and is accessible to both children and grown-ups without feeling like it panders to either demographic. It's not just a good animated Star Trek story or a good Star Trek story. It's a good story, period. Those are my thoughts on Yesteryear, my favorite episode of Star Trek the Animated Series. What's your favorite animated series episode? Please share it with me in the comments. If you'd like to support this channel, and I sure wish you would, if you can afford it, you can do so by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Steve Shives, becoming a channel member by clicking the join button, or by making a one-time gift by clicking the thanks button, or via PayPal or Venmo. Links are in the description. Don't forget to watch my review of the 6th episode of Season 3 of Star Trek Picard. I'm teaming up with my best friend and podcast co-host, Jason Harding, to review this final season of Picard. Our next review will be a little late. We typically do them on Saturday, but we won't be able to do this one until Monday due to Jason's work schedule. It's all Jason's fault. I take no responsibility. So look for that on Monday, and please join me again at this time next week for another retro review. I'll be starting a new batch of these, looking at episodes that feature guest stars from previous Trek series. And I'm beginning with the 2-part TNG episode that had the heroes of Star Trek The Next Generation meet Spock, Unification. I'll see you then. Thanks for watching, and take care, everybody.